¿Cansado del trabajo o andas desparchado y quieres dejar de pensar en tantos problemas? Tranquilo, sintoniza a Los Exiliados, un programa que con humor y una pizca de atrevimiento hablamos de temas necesarios pero impopulares.
¿De qué me habla, bien?
Acompáñanos todos los viernes de 5 a 7 de la noche y pasa un momento divertido. Y no, tranquilo, no hay devoluciones.
In that airplane in the night sky like shooting stars. I can hear you whisper now, whisper now, whisper now. So we pretend that airplane in the night sky like shooting stars. I can hear you whisper now, whisper now, whisper now. Yeah.
4:08 de la tarde, esto es su programa Exiliados, comenzando una vez más, transmitiendo desde el 95.3 FM y por nuestras redes sociales para todos sus pastiras a Sabana Norte. Aquí no me van a creer, pero tengo el micrófono en la mano. Gracias, Casi y Morenaza. Buenas tardes.
Muy buenas tardes para todos. Un saludo súper especial. Todos felices, todos contentos porque hoy es viernes. Gracias a Dios, hoy es viernes. Tenemos una parrilla full, tenemos el programa nuestro el día de hoy. Esta mañana tuvimos una entrevista súper especial. En la noche todos súper invitadísimos porque tenemos el café concierto. Los dos grandes artistas el día de hoy aquí en el... Dos grandes artistas a quienes esperamos con gran entusiasmo. Y pues nada, un saludo muy especial a mi mesa de trabajo el día de hoy. ¿Cómo se encuentran, chicos?
Bueno, pues primero que todo, buenas tardes a todos nuestros queridos oyentes, buenas tardes a mi mesa de trabajo. Estoy muy feliz, muy emocionada hoy. Por fin llegó la morenaza porque esta mañana nos dejó solitos y nos tenía tristes. No, yo ya no puedo sin ti. Esto de ser la única mujer es muy duro.
Ahora también, pero ¿quién está haciendo la
voy a llegar el patriarcado.
Y esta mañana hizo reír a nuestro invitado, ¿no?
Sí, le hice unas preguntitas por ahí.
Lo hizo reír un rato. Muy bien. Hoy es el día de... El 3 de julio de 1971 moría a esta hora uno de los artistas más significativos de mi vida, yo creo, el señor Jim Morrison, más conocido como The Lizard King, el Rey Lagarto, conocido también por canciones como This is the End, Riders on the Storm, Reckon 2, You Help Me, L.A. something,
L.A. Woman,
L.A. Woman,
Light My Fire.
Oh, Light My Fire. El tipo que siempre hizo poesía hecha música. Él sacó un libro que se llama libro de poesía American Poet, creo que es el American Poet de Jim Morrison. Y pues una verdadera lástima para todos los seguidores del rock, del verdadero rock and roll. Junto con Jim Manzarek y no recuerdo si dos acompañantes formaron esta legendaria banda que se llamaba The Doors. Así que mientras ya vamos con la entrevista
con la historiadora Manisha Sinha.
Ok, mientras tanto vamos a escuchar algo de Jim Morrison, esto que se llama Light My Fire. Un momento, ¿qué necesita el niño?
Antes de que continuemos, hay que decir que Jim Morrison abandonó un mes antes de su muerte la banda de Doors.
Sí, se fue a morir a Francia. Es que todos los americanos buenos mueren en Francia, dicen por ahí. Y los tontos vienen así. Entonces, ¿qué hacemos? Muy bien, vamos a dejarnos aquí con la Riders on the Storm. Ya volvemos, esto es Exiliados.
And when your plans unravel in the sand, what would you wish for if you had one chance? So airplane, sorry, I'm late.
like a dog without a bone and actor out alone. Riders on the storm. There's a killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. Take a long holiday. Let your children play. If your children plan a ride, family will die. Killer on the road.
pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars. I can hear you whisper now, whisper now, whisper now. Could you pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars? I can hear you whisper now, whisper now, whisper now.
4:19 de la tarde es el programa de Exiliados. Hoy tenemos una increíble invitada. Tenemos una historiadora, la señora Manisha Sinha, quien amablemente aceptó la invitación del señor Ray Dogwood, de nuestro rayito de sol. La única vez para verlo contento es cuando tiene invitada. De resto, lo verán en su estado natural. Así que, mi queridísimo Riley, por favor, saludemos a la invitada.
Dr. Sinha, welcome to Seep of Exiles. Dr. Sinha? Dr. Sinha, can you hear us? Dr. Sinha, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Welcome to SIPA Exiles, Dr. Sinha. Thanks for accepting our invitation to be in our show. Riley, your question.
Okay, again, thanks again so much for joining us to reacquaint, our Spanish listeners heard the introduction, but for anybody who didn't catch that, Dr. Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at University of Connecticut. She is a specialist in 19th century U.S. history of slavery, abolition, and the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. She's the author of the book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. So, we've got a relatively wide range of topics covered today, but I'd like to start with your book on abolition.
One second, I will translate. Para nuestros queridos en Radio Escuchas, hoy tenemos a la doctora Manisha Sinha, quien es una historiadora, es la secretaria del Departamento de Historia de la Universidad de Connecticut. Ella es la autora del libro La causa de los esclavos, o The Slave's Cause, de la historia de la abolición de 2016, y con el cual ella ganó un premio que es el Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Al igual, la doctora Sinha es especialista en historia del siglo XIX de Estados Unidos.
Okay, so starting with your book, with your work on abolition. Now, your book is a history of abolition. So the first thing I'd like to ask is, when you were writing it, what did you have in mind as the greatest myth or misconception about the abolitionist movement?
Yes, so when I started writing my book on abolition, I noticed that much of the popular literature on abolitionists concentrated on white middle-class abolitionists from the North, portrayed them as sort of simple heroic figures. And in academia, they were seen more as paternalistic, as generally conservative on economic matters, if not matters of race. And so I try to reimagine the abolition movement in my book as a radical interracial movement in which blacks and whites, men and women played an important part. And I guess that was the main sort of thesis of the book. It took me a long time to write it. I wrote it over 10 years, and while I was writing it, I had no idea that we would see the emergence of the movement for Black Lives. But in fact, when it was published in 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement had just taken off in the United States. And everyone thought that I had planned it, but that was actually not true at all, because I had been working on this book for decades before it was published.
Muy bien, Ray le preguntaba cuando comenzó a escribir este libro, cuáles eran los mitos acerca de la abolición. de la abolición. La doctora Sinha nos dice que la literatura popular de ese entonces fue escrita sobre todo por blancos, y pues blancos de media clase o clase alta, abolicionadores del norte o conservadores, y como tal no representaban mucho la idea de lo que era la verdadera historia de la abolición. Sin embargo, después ella entendió que debería hacer una investigación acerca de la abolición, del movimiento de abolición, y en la escritura de este libro le tardó aproximadamente unos 10 años, pero nunca pensó que iba a generar un impacto sobre los movimientos contemporáneos como Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras importan. Y cuando se publicó este libro en el 2016, digamos que empató con el movimiento de las vidas negras también importan.
So, all right. So now your book is a history of abolition that covers a fairly long period of time. How do you say that the abolition movement evolved from the colonial era to the antebellum era?
That's a good question, because most people, when they looked at the abolition movement, tended to concentrate on the period just before the Civil War, so around 20 or 30 years before the war, in the 19th century. And I went back to the 18th century to look at the first wave of abolition, because a lot of the abolitionists I studied in the 19th century constantly referred to abolitionists from an earlier time period. And when I started looking at the earlier period, I realized that even our understanding of that first wave of abolition during the revolutionary era, during the age of revolutions, which we see as starting off with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and ending with the Latin American Wars of Independence, I found that even for that period, you had a number of abolitionists who were not just fighting against slavery, but were also imagining black people as equal citizens of the American Republic. Now that was very different than the way in which people wrote about that earlier period. They always saw that period as sort of more conservative and elitist, and that the 19th century way was far more radical. And to a certain extent, that is true, but I was also able to challenge this notion that the early Quaker and black abolitionists were necessarily elitist and conservative. And even for that earlier period, I think the role of Afro-Americans had especially been downplayed. So when people looked at early abolitionists, they again saw a kind of white paternalistic movement. Instead, I found that there were many black abolitionists that were active in that earlier period and who were writing about their experience. And if you looked at it transnationally, you found a whole new group of black abolitionists also emerging in Britain within the movement to abolish the slave trade. So I was able to uncover a lot of that history in looking at this book. I imagined it as a fairly small book initially, but it turned out to be a big book that goes from the American Revolution to the Civil War and covers the first wave of abolition in the 18th century as well as the second wave in the 19th century.
Muy bien, Ray me preguntaba acerca de cuál ha sido la evolución de la historia de la abolición desde lo que fue el periodo de la colonia al periodo de la revolución.
De la guerra civil.
De la guerra civil, perdón. Y entonces ella nos habla que en su libro ella se intentó concentrar en lo que fue antes de la guerra. Ella quiso ir al siglo XVIII y encontrar los abolicionistas del siglo XVIII, del siglo XIX, lo que ella considera la primera ola de la revolución. Entonces ella hace referencia sobre todo a todos aquellos movimientos en los que hubo movimientos de personas de raza negra en los que estaban en contra del tratado de esclavos y de la esclavitud, no solo en los Estados Unidos, sino también hablamos de los movimientos de la Revolución Francesa y de los movimientos de los procesos de revoluciones en Latinoamérica. Ella también escribió o hace como describe que generalmente en el siglo XIX la mayoría de la literatura fue escrita por un sector muy elitista y muy radical, incluso muy conservador en el siglo XIX. Entonces ella decidió retar esta concepción tan paternalista y trató de ir más allá a lo que era los abolicionistas del siglo XVIII y sobre todo aquellos que estuvieron en contra del comercio de esclavos.
And so it seems that, okay, so you're challenging the notion of challenging the sort of caricature, you might say, of a conservative, paternalistic, middle-class abolitionist movement. It also seems kind of like you're challenging the idea of a homogenous abolitionist movement. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I do see the abolition movement as a diverse movement that included blacks and women, and that these groups, these disfranchised groups in the early American Republic, were not peripheral to the abolition movement, that they in fact were central to it and helped to define its radical politics. I also wanted to make clear that the movement as a whole, even its relatively more conservative side, like the evangelicals, tended to be very progressive, and they were certainly radical by the standards of their time, because they were not just arguing against slavery, but they were advocating racial equality. There is a tendency nowadays to confuse the evangelical abolitionists of the 19th century with the fundamentalist evangelicals in the United States today. In fact, these were very different men and women. They tended to be very liberal in their theology, very progressive in their ideas. A lot of the fundamentalist evangelicals today in the United States are direct descendants of those churches and denominations that were very fundamentalist in the 19th century and that were pro-slavery and that in fact defended slavery quite vigorously. So it was important for me while I was writing the book to make some of these distinctions clear, because sometimes we use the same words but we are literally talking about a very different group of people.
Muy bien, preguntaba Riley que de la misma manera que ella retó en su investigación esa visión conservativa y paternalista, pues también de cierta manera retó una visión modernista de la misma. Ella dice que la doctora Sinha dice que por supuesto es un reto en contra de cómo definir los movimientos de la República temprana, cómo funcionaban estos movimientos progresistas, quiénes eran los movimientos, quiénes formaban parte de los movimientos radicales a través del tiempo, cómo se hablaba acerca de la igualdad racial. También tomaba en cuenta los movimientos evangélicos abolicionistas del siglo XIX y cómo se dividían en dos prácticamente. Uno eran los liberales progresistas y los otros, aunque no lo crean, hubo movimientos evangélicos de esa época e incluso época contemporánea que todavía defendían de cierta manera la esclavitud.
So today with things happening like Black Lives Matter movement and this kind of reckoning we're having with race in the United States, what would you say is the most significant legacy of the abolition movement?
Yes, so I feel that one of the important things that I wanted to make clear about the abolition and blacks and whites were not just against slavery, they were also fighting for equal citizenship for people of African descent in the United States. So many times they were involved in campaigns in the North to do away with laws or customs that discriminated against black people. Because except for a handful of New England states, black men, for instance, did not enjoy an equal right to vote in the United States before the Civil War, and these were free black men. And of course, women were completely disfranchised. So this quest for equal black citizenship, I argue, has a really long historical genealogy. It has its roots in the abolition movement. And so when I ended my book, I talked about many contemporary forms of activism, like the fight against mass incarceration, which many times uses the word abolition to characterize its position, or sometimes the ways in which black activists have used terms from the abolition movement, naming their newspapers The Liberator, after William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. He was a prominent abolitionist, and his newspaper was extremely important in the movement. So I think African Americans themselves have been aware of this history of activism, but now I think modern day activists are also reading about it, and that is something that gave me quite a lot of pleasure when I heard that the book was making itself, was being included in lists put together by activists on the ground who were fighting against particular injustices. Even during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, for instance, many of the activists called themselves the new abolitionists and called for the second reconstruction of American democracy. So I think most activists themselves are aware of it, are aware of this history, but it was important for them also to understand the role that African Americans had played in the abolition movement.
Muy bien, preguntaba Riley acerca de hoy, teniendo en cuenta el movimiento, la Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras también importan, ¿cuál podría ser el legado de este libro? Ella nos habla que, la doctora Sinha nos habla que el legado que podemos traducir para ese entonces es acerca de la forma como se habla de la esclavitud, acerca de la igualdad, de cómo en un principio se discriminaba en el norte a los ciudadanos americanos negros, quienes en sí eran ciudadanos pero no tenían derecho al voto, y ni hablar de las mujeres, que eran aún más discriminadas. Entonces este movimiento impulsó la ciudadanía completa de los ciudadanos negros, y también cambió la visión contemporánea de las formas de activismo. El activismo que hoy tenemos se creó gracias, por ejemplo, al periódico El Liberador o El Liberator, donde digamos empezó a escribir, y aunque fue un poco difícil para la época, se empezó a escribir acerca de los derechos de los negros y acerca de la abolición como tal. Sin ir más lejos, en los 60 comenzó el movimiento de los derechos civiles. También se tomó por así decirlo, un movimiento del nuevo abolicionalismo de los 60.
So we talked a bit about abolition movement. Let's get in a little bit about the flip side. So we talked about how the abolition movement evolved from the colonial era to the Civil War era. What about slavery? We've heard a lot of scholars about how it was a dynamic institution. How did it evolve over that same time period?
That's a very good question. So in a way, one could also talk about a first wave and a second wave of slavery, as we do with abolition. So when slavery first emerged in British North America, and of course we know that there was a Spanish presence in North America, in Florida and the Southwest before the British founded their colonies. So already in the 16th century, you have the introduction of black slavery. But really, when you begin with the British North American colonies, one can see how slavery gradually becomes legal in all the British colonies by the early 18th century. Historians make a difference between the southern colonies, which were plantation societies and tended to grow staple crops, and the northern colonies where slavery was legal. So these were societies with slaves, so they were not slave societies, but slavery was not a central defining characteristic. If you think of the southern United States, it really emerges as really the northern border of the slave system that spread right through Latin America. Now, with the Latin American Wars of Independence, many of the Spanish colonies actually abolished slavery gradually, including Mexico, but the United States did not. Only the northern states abolished slavery, while the southern states, which had plantation slavery, continued to have slavery, and not only did they continue to have slavery, but this system grew and expanded into the Southwest. So many historians call this period in the 19th century the second slavery. This is when you have the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom in the Southwest, and you have also the older slave crops like tobacco in Virginia, rice in South Carolina, Low Country, Georgia, and sugar in Louisiana. When you have the second slavery in the United States in the 19th century, there are only three really big slave societies that are left in the Americas by the mid-19th century. It's the United States South, it's Brazil, and Cuba. And of course Puerto Rico, though that's not a huge slave society. It's not as big a society devoted to slavery as these other countries. So these were the three sort of holdouts in terms of slavery, and slavery was not a dying institution in these countries, meaning the notion that somehow slavery would eventually disappear of itself is actually quite a ridiculous one, because most historians studying the 19th century and studying the second slavery show that slavery was vibrant and expansive, and this is in a way what creates the sectional conflict between the North and the South, because some people imagine that slavery would somehow just disappear on its own in the American Republic. That was not happening. It was actually extremely vibrant, very profitable, and expanding at a rapid rate, and slaveholders were coming to dominate national politics in a way that was fairly undemocratic. And that is what actually leads to the rise of an anti-slavery Republican Party and to the rise of Lincoln. It is an attempt to halt the expansion of slavery into the West, because people really feared that the American Republic would become, and it was in a way a slaveholding republic, but it would become a republic which would be known more for slavery than for its founding ideals. So the second slavery is what gives rise to the Civil War in the United States. And of course, Southerners, because slavery is so profitable for them and because it is so woven into their lives, do not take the election of Lincoln very quietly. They decide that that is enough reason for them to actually secede from the United States and actually form a slave republic, the Confederacy. And for your viewers who might be confused, I must tell them that everything you know about the Republican and Democratic parties today in the United States, they need to simply flip it for the 19th century. The Republican Party at that time was the party of racial liberalism, big government, anti-slavery. It was the party of Lincoln. The Democratic Party was the party of the South, of conservatism, of states' rights, and of white supremacy. Ideologically, the two parties have literally switched roles today.
Okay.
Muy bien. Preguntaba Riley acerca de cómo fue por así decirlo, la esclavitud durante la era colonial y después cómo entró a la época de la guerra civil, cómo fue ese progreso. Nos dice la doctora Sinha que nos explica los dos movimientos de esclavitud en la primera ola y la segunda ola. Hablamos en un comienzo cuando se establecieron las primeras colonias en los Estados Unidos, que fueron principalmente por los españoles, lo que fue la Florida. Digamos que ellos trajeron, por así decirlo, la esclavitud. Luego llegaron los británicos y establecieron sus colonias sobre todo al norte de los Estados Unidos, y emergió acogieron la esclavitud como tal. Gradualmente, a través del siglo XVIII, las colonias fueron legalizando la esclavitud, por así decirlo, tanto en el sur como en el norte, sobre todo en el sur, que se utilizaban en las plantaciones de algodón, y también en la parte norte de los Estados Unidos fue bastante revitable el negocio de la esclavitud. Sin embargo, a través de los años, cuando empieza este despertar en Latinoamérica, donde digámoslo así, que las mismas colonias de España, o las colonias que fueron conquistadas por España, empezaron a hacer la abolición de la esclavitud. Este movimiento, digamos, que se empezó a expandir a través del continente, pero aunque uno no lo crea, en los Estados Unidos no se expandió como se hubiera querido. Entonces ahí resumimos lo que es la primera ola de la esclavitud en los Estados Unidos. Después de cuando comienzan estas revoluciones en Sudamérica, aparece la segunda ola. La segunda ola es cuando ya, digámoslo así, se vuelve más que un negocio en lo que fueron las plantaciones de tabaco y de algodón, en lo que es Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Luisiana, donde, por así decirlo, se industrializó de cierta manera la esclavitud. Podemos hablar que en el siglo XIX tres grandes sociedades aún tenían la esclavitud como en funcionamiento, por así decirlo, legalizadas, y eran los Estados Unidos, Brasil, Cuba, y también hacía referencia acerca de Puerto Rico. Esto no desaparece durante la República, aunque sí aparecen los movimientos anti-esclavistas. Aunque no lo crean, el Partido Republicano fue muy importante durante el tiempo de Lincoln, y también ella nos hacía que muchas veces hay una confusión en lo que es hoy el Partido Demócrata y el Partido Republicano, porque digamos que hubo un cambio, una rotación en estos partidos, ya que en el tiempo del mismo Lincoln, en el tiempo del siglo XIX, los republicanos eran los que hablaban de el liberalismo racial, o de la liberación de la esclavitud, mientras los demócratas eran más conservadores. Incluso había supremacistas blancos, y era una sociedad más por así decirlo, un partido más ligado a la esclavitud.
Okay. So moving on to a subject that is of concern in the present day, regarding our battles over historical memory. Right now there's a great deal of there's always been controversy over Confederate monuments, and right now many monuments are being taken down either peacefully by civil authorities or less peacefully in protests. Regarding Confederate monuments, first of all, just to be clear, what do you say to those who insist that Confederate monuments are a part of our history and should be left up?
Well, I don't think monuments are really the best way to understand our history. To learn history, you must read a book. Monuments are the most simple ways to do public history, and they tend to commemorate people, to recognize them. And in that sense, I think the Confederate monuments are extremely pernicious because they're not history, they're mythology, and they also cause active political harm. Most Confederate monuments were put up at the end of the 19th century when the attempt to give black people citizenship and black men the right to vote after the Civil War and after the destruction of slavery had failed. So that they were meant to commemorate the triumph of white supremacy in the South, which included the disfranchisement of black men, but also a regime of racial terror with lynching and with sharecropping and death peonage, generally consigning African Americans to second-class citizenship, and the installation of racial segregation, of Jim Crow in the South. So they're extremely pernicious. If one looked at many of these Confederate monuments in the South and you just didn't know anything about American history, you might be forgiven for thinking that the Confederacy actually won the war because there's so many Confederate monuments. So one, they are not history. They in fact are not even Southern heritage. If they do represent some sort of Southern heritage, it is a heritage of hate. And it has been mobilized recently by white supremacists and neo-Confederates in very harmful ways. They always send out a message that African Americans are less than equal in this country. And for that reason, I think all Confederate monuments, and I say this as a historian, should be completely done away with.
Okay.
We don't need a statue of Hitler to remind us of the history of Nazism. Similarly, we don't need statues of Confederate generals and politicians to remind us of the misbegotten experiment that was the Confederacy, the attempt to found a nation on human bondage, on slavery. And, for decades, people had been fighting against this in peaceful ways, petitioning Southern state governments, etc., to take down these monuments. After the massacre in the Charleston Ames Church in 2015, some were taken down. After the march of neo-Nazis in 2017, others were taken down. But it has really been the upsurge in the movement for Black Lives this year after the murder of George Floyd that there is a systematic attempt to take them down. And some cities have just simply removed these monuments. Certain local governments, even defying some of their state governments controlled by the Republican Party that have passed laws against the removal of Confederate monuments. Others have been taken down by protesters, and I, for one, have felt that the taking down of these monuments by the protesters is an act of democracy, very similar to the ways in which New Yorkers destroyed a statue of King George III during the American Revolution.
Pregunta a Riley acerca de la controversia generada últimamente en lo que tiene que ver los monumentos de los confederados, generales más todo, ¿verdad?
Más que todo, sí.
Generales de las tropas confederadas, en el que digamos que hay una controversia en Estados Unidos porque se insiste en que es parte de la historia americana. La doctora Sinha nos dice que algo muy importante que es muy valedero, y es que para aprender historia hay que leer un libro, no hay que ver monumentos. Los monumentos son para conmemorar gente, pero no son historias. Digamos lo que estos monumentos muchas veces son para tratan de darnos un mensaje del triunfo de los blancos en el sur, de el terror. Se conmemora los linchamientos, el terror, las matanzas, la esclavitud de los afroamericanos, que eran considerados prácticamente segunda clase, eran segregados. Pero nos dice la doctora Sinha que la Confederación no ganó, ellos fueron los que perdieron la guerra. Entonces estos monumentos promueven el odio porque digamos que han sido parte para que los blancos supremacistas se congreguen alrededor de ellos. No olvidemos que estos movimientos fueron los que estos monumentos, o parte de la historia de estos monumentos, son los que generaron partes de la historia, como es los Jim Crow en el sur, es como el apodo que tenían los negros en ese entonces, ¿verdad? Por décadas se han luchado para que se desmonten estos monumentos en los Estados Unidos, hasta incluso en el 2015, cuando hubo una ola para desmontar muchas de estas estatuas. Pero ahora, con la muerte de George Floyd, digamos así que comenzó un nuevo movimiento para bajar los monumentos. Incluso en los estados donde hay senadores republicanos quienes han pasado leyes para no removerlos. Sin ir más lejos, recordamos en Nueva York cuando se desmontó la estatua de George III.
And so, some of us might content ourselves with sort of a simple idea that only Confederate monuments are being attacked, but that's not the case. There are other monuments that are being targeted by protesters right now that are not associated with the Confederacy. And in some cases, some people might say they're problematic, and others less so. What's your take on those, on non-Confederate memorials being targeted?
Yeah. So you are right. The taking down of Confederate monuments has led to a broader conversation about, what are the statues and monuments that are there in our local communities, and that people pretty much did not notice. But now they're looking at them and saying, well, what do these statues represent if the Confederate statues are so pernicious? In the North, most of the monuments to the Union Army, I really like them because they're very democratic. They are not for a single person or a single general. Usually, they tend to be monuments of, dedicated to Union Army soldiers and to their sacrifice. There are other monuments in the Southwest that have been taken down of Spanish conquistadors, monuments of Christopher Columbus. Some of these conquistadors were pretty brutal in their actions against indigenous populations, and I think the local populations there, both Hispanos and Anglos, have the perfect right to look at these statues of some of these Spanish conquistadors and say, do we want these monuments to represent us today as a local community in 2020, which is very diverse and which includes a lot of Native Americans. So I think these are conversations that local communities ought to have, because our tax dollars go to maintain these monuments. What message are they sending? Are they sending a message that represents us as modern communities, or do we want them to represent us as modern communities? I don't think history is harmed by doing that. Columbus statues have been taken down. Columbus did not ever come to British North America. His statues were put up by Italian American communities in the 20th century because he was a merchant from Genoa. And some of these Italian American communities have themselves decided to take down Columbus's statues. I know that has happened in Connecticut. So, as I said, these are conversations that local communities need to have. Columbus himself was involved in the murder and torture of Native American populations, including children, and his own writings tell us that.
Okay.
So his statues have been taken down not as an affront to the Spanish monarch who he was representing, but really, as I said, it was put up by Italian-American communities.
Okay.
The other statues that some people want to take down, I think, are a little more problematic. For instance, slave-holding founding fathers, or Ulysses Grant, who led the Union Army. Now, those people who oppose the taking down of Confederate statues always argue that, oh, we are going down a slippery slope and soon we will be taking down the statues of Washington and Jefferson and everyone else. I don't think that's been the mainstream of the movement. That has really been a fringe part of the movement. Not many of those statues have been taken down at all. As a historian, I think those statues are actually begging for historical contextualization. For instance, we don't need to whitewash history to understand that some of the Virginian founding fathers were large slaveholders. But we also need to recognize some of the good they may have done. For instance, Washington freed his slaves when he died. And when I was researching my book on abolition, I came across this wonderful eulogy on Washington by a black abolitionist, who was living at that time. We don't even need to judge these people by our times. We can look at what abolitionists then were saying about them. So I think those statues can be contextualized. We can talk about the good as well as the bad. We don't need to take those down, because then we are going to end up with like a massive, a pointless, I think, exercise in destroying each and every monument. Many of those monuments can be contextualized historically, and I would prefer that.
Okay, good. As a quick note, you should probably know that Columbia itself is named after Columbus, so here we've got a pretty massive thing regarding that kind of memorialization. Anyway, so Andres, you're going to translate?
Yeah, no.
Well, it's been renamed once before in history. It began as King's College, and then it became Columbia after the United States became independent, and that's something that the university itself has to decide. I don't think that's in our realm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was referring to this country of Columbia, but yes, that's also
sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Muy bien.
Yes, of course.
Por así decirlo, hablamos de la pregunta es acerca de los otros monumentos, los que no son los monumentos de los confederados, que muchas veces los americanos están tumbando monumentos que nada tienen que ver con los mismos generales confederados o que pertenecieron al ejército unionista. La doctora Sinha nos decía que estos monumentos son dedicados sobre todo al sacrificio de los soldados. Por así decirlo, ella también nos habla de los monumentos acerca, por ejemplo, de Cristóbal Colón, quien también, aunque nunca estuvo, por ejemplo, en la América Británica o en la British America, tiene monumentos y digamos que él fue una persona brutal en contra de los indígenas y los hispanos. Incluso los mismos italoamericanos, que sabiendo que Cristóbal Colón nació en Génova, no están de acuerdo que los dólares de los impuestos sean dedicados para mantener esta clase de monumentos, porque ¿qué representan estos monumentos? Sin embargo, por ejemplo, habla de los monumentos que muchas veces por error tal vez se asume que son repugnantes a la sociedad, pero por ejemplo están los de los padres fundadores como Ulysses Grant, que era padre de Union Army.
Sí.
Del ejército unionista. Entonces digamos que no representa el corazón de este movimiento, porque los padres se debe contextualizar a muchos de estos monumentos que están por fuera de lo que significan los monumentos de los confederados, de personas que no tuvieron nada que ver en contra de la, digámoslo así, esclavitud, o en contra de la brutalidad, o en contra del asesinato o la tragedia de los negros en los Estados Unidos, y que sin embargo pues los están tumbando. Entonces lo mismo pasa aquí en Colombia o en México, donde las feministas están tumbando monumentos. Puede ser algo así parecido. Y nos recordaba Riley que nuestro propio país, Colombia, lleva el nombre en honor a Colón, quien, digamos así, también fue brutal en contra de los indígenas.
So, we are going to be running out of time fairly soon. I have one very quick thing left to ask you. Keep in mind that we're time limited here. Yesterday, I was able to ask a question on a live stream by the American Historical Association with David Blight and Annette Gordon Reed, and they did get to my question. But I'd like to ask you the same thing, which is regarding, I'm kind of curious since I'm from a Western state, and kind of curious about how we should approach the commemoration of figures who fought for the rights of African Americans, but also had a more troubled relation with Native Americans. The examples I used were Philip Sheridan and Oliver Otis Howard. Sheridan, who was alleged to have said the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and Howard, who, while not exactly a household name, is known among the Nez Perce people whom helped displace. So I was kind of curious for your take on those kinds of figures. Just keep in mind that we're time limited, please.
Yes. So, of course, all these Union Army generals, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Howard, who were pretty heroic when it comes to the Civil War, do not have a great reputation in the West because they were involved in these very brutal wars against the Plains Indians and the dispossession of Native Americans. To a certain extent, they were part of the army, and certainly Grant was president. They were pretty much being sent by the federal government, and many times they were being solicited by local populations, settler populations, to either retaliate against Indians and dispossess them of their lands. And if you look at the history of the Indian Wars, there's so many massacres and there's just a lot of that going on at that point. And again, I think there's no need to whitewash the history. If you're talking about General Howard, you can talk about him as the founder of the Freedmen or the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, but you can also talk about his role in the battles against the Nez Perce. Similarly with Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. I don't think there are actually that many statues to them, but if there are, they can be contextualized. But I would also remind everyone that these are the front lines of this entire process of dispossessing Native Americans of their lands. The entire country of the United States is built on the dispossession of Native Americans. And nearly every American president, including the ones that we admire the most, like Abraham Lincoln, do not have a good record when it comes to dealing with Native Americans. So if we are going to go down that path, then we could call for the dismantling for the entire country, as you just reminded me that the country of Colombia, after all, is named after Christopher Columbus, so I like Bolivarian Republic better. I think these are conversations that we need to have. If there are Native American communities that don't want a statue of certainly somebody like Sheridan in their backyard, they are perfectly entitled to take that down or contextualize it. As I said, it has to be local conversations. I don't think we can have kind of a national standard, because if we do that, then as I said, the entire country has been founded on the dispossession of Native Americans. We have to dismantle what we have now, and since we can't do that, I think it is very important to have these conversations, to uncover the history, not whitewash the history, acknowledge it, and perhaps think about making amends in our time.
Muy bien, preguntaba Riley acerca de aquellos estatuas monumentos que hay cerca del estado del este de los Estados Unidos, de Washington State, ¿no?
Del oeste,
del oeste de los Estados Unidos, en los cuales hay ciertas estatuas o monumentos de generales de la Unión que digamos que aunque han luchado por los derechos de los negros, de cierta manera fueron opresores de los nativos americanos. Entonces, ¿cómo aproximarnos hacia por ejemplo, estatuas de General Grant, Sherman, Howard o Sheraton? Nos decía la doctora Sinha que, digámoslo así, estas estatuas hay que hacer una conversación más que todo local. Hay que contextualizar localmente, hay que hacer una conversación con las personas, porque pues digámoslo así, que a través de todos los Estados Unidos hay estatuas o monumentos de estas personas, y en ciertas partes de los mismos Estados Unidos no representan, ya que se basaron acerca del despojo de tierras de los nativos americanos. En muchas partes se les pedía a estos generales que tuvieran una especie de retaliación en contra de los indígenas. Muchas comunidades nativoamericanas piden que en su patio no debe haber estatuas de estos mismos generales. Citaba ella, por ejemplo, a Sherman o Howard. Entonces, digamos lo que hay que acudir a una contextualización y sobre todo una educación, y en estas comunidades a una conversación más local.
Okay, so Dr. Sinha, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure whenever we get to speak with American historians. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Gracias. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. Bueno, y recuerden que hoy conmemoramos la muerte de uno de los grandes de Jim Morrison, el Rey Lagarto, y nos vamos con una canción de él, Capi, la que usted quiera.
Somos la radio en Zipaquirá y Sabana Centro. Somos 95.3 FM. Armonía.